From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
This week, we are focusing on a couple of issues related to the conflict between Ukraine, NATO, aka the Global West, and Russia. We're probably going to do some more episodes about this. As you know, fellow conspiracy realists, we don't always, we're not always super eager to cover ongoing events because no one yet, not even DARPA, can predict the future. But what we can do, what we must do, is dive into the context behind this conflict. It's crucial, it's crazy, and in some cases, it's very, very much the stuff they don't want you to know. So the story starts way before the current conflict. It starts way before the 2014 annexation or retaking of Crimea. Here are the facts. First thing, I think we can say it because we're based in the U.S., until fairly recently, until like 2014 in March, a lot of people in the U.S. would not have been able to reliably point out Ukraine on a map. And that's not a ding on any resident of the U.S. It's just, there are a lot of countries and they would have known that Ukraine was in Europe, but they would have, if they had a blank map, they would have maybe had a tough time figuring out which one was Ukraine.
I mean, I think a lot of people probably embarrassingly mistake Ukrainians for Russians sometimes. Their written language looks similar. There's a similarity in the accent, but I have a feeling that is going to become a very unpopular mistake to make.
Yeah, Noel, when you say that, for a second I had deja vu, and then I can't remember if we had a very similarly accurate conversation several years ago in 2014. You're absolutely right. And they share, as we'll find, a very close, very connected cultural history with several other modern day countries in the area. I mean, it is a shame that the country was so unfamiliar to so many Americans, because if you just look at the facts, Ukraine has been, and will remain to be, a resource giant. I learned so many weird trade facts about Ukraine over the past 3 weeks or so, just looking into stuff, looking past the headlines, like bees.
Yeah, I think we all have.
Yeah, for sure. And that would make them sort of like a powerhouse in and of themselves, in terms of imports and exports and, being a global citizen in terms of the economy, correct?
Yes, sir. Everything from uranium to titanium, from shale gas reserves to barley and wheat. They're also a transit country for a lot of Western Europe's energy resources. And not for nothing was Ukraine often called the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, or the breadbasket of Russia or Europe even. I mean, okay, the bee thing, I don't know why that surprises me. I put in a list of all these exports that Ukraine has, but they are the 5th biggest bee producer in the world. Who would have thought that? I mean, a lot of people in Ukraine are like, yeah, but I don't think the three of us knew.
In terms of like honeybees, like for, that kind of thing?
Just bees, man. I assume honeybees and not carpenter bees. But I do love the idea.
I mean, people that are setting up bee farms, they need like stock to start with, right? And
right.
Sometimes you want to get the good bees. So I guess that's where Ukraine comes in.
I just love the idea that somewhere out there in Eastern Europe, there's a business tycoon, and people are like, I know, sorry. And people are like, hey, what do you do for a living? He's like, I'm into bees. And he's telling the truth, or she. So this place isn't just a resource giant. It is also a very ancient land. If you look back to the earliest traces of human habitation, we're talking tens of thousands of years ago. If you lived in Europe from like the 9th to 11th century, CE, that is, you would see that an empire called Kievan Rus would have been the largest empire in your part of the world if you were in Eastern Europe.
And this would have been well before it was part of the Soviet Union or like ruled by a czar from Moscow, correct?
Correct. Way before.
Way before.
We're talking about 980 to 1015.
Yeah, kind of. That's kind of a golden age of Kiev or of Kievan Rus. Today, if you look at the modern cultures that sprang from this empire, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, they all claim ancestry from that empire. And it makes sense. I mean, in Belarus and Russia, it's in the name. They just went with that name. And and it's fair to say that right now, propaganda aside, right now, Ukraine, which is a democracy, is overwhelmingly in favor of remaining an independent, sovereign state. But it's important to note the population is not monolithic. There are a lot of people in the eastern area of Ukraine that speak Russian. They're ethnically Russian. There maybe some of them are not necessarily opposed to Russia becoming once again a hegemonic force and them functioning as like a vassal or client state. But that's not the majority of Ukrainian opinion.
Yeah, I'm going to recommend a video everybody watch after you listen to this episode. It's from Gravitas Plus. It's titled Explained, the Russia-Ukraine Crisis. It goes over a map that shows exactly where on that eastern side of Ukraine, where the Russian-speaking populations are that would probably be more and are more likely to want intervention from Russia. And it is a very like small relative chunk, right, compared to the rest of Ukraine, as you're saying, Ben.
There's also a documentary that I have not gotten to yet, but I plan to. It's called Winter on Fire, Ukraine's Fight for Freedom, that really goes very deep into all of these specific kind of cultural differences and the history of Ukraine and its relationship with Russia.
Mm-hmm. Which is complicated and fraught, but it is important context here. And, obviously when we're saying there are Russian speaking areas of the country where some people might be more in support of the Russian perspective in this conflict, that is by no means us saying that the entirety of that region is in support. There is an open invasion, a conflict, a war. But Russian historians have a very different idea of how the present state of affairs came to be and a bit of a different narrative of how we got there. So they consider Kievan Rus to be like the first period of Russian history. So while that modern conflict or this modern conflict may seem to have relatively recent beginnings to many outsiders, it is mission critical to understand that the makings of this current situation date far back into antiquity.
And we're talking about Russian historians as in, academics that specialize in the history of Russia, not necessarily historians from Russia who may have a very different view of this, who are like government sanctioned. In terms of the line, the party line, we know how that narrative can be manipulated and made into propaganda.
Yeah, but we do have to acknowledge Kievan Rus, from which these modern cultures sprang. And when we're talking about history, a lot of times when you're hearing some policy wonk or boffin talk about historical context for this conflict, they're going to be talking about the USSR, because to understand what's happening in Ukraine and in Eastern Ukraine and Crimea, we have to get past the headlines to the story of the Soviet Union. For many, many years, Ukraine was part of the USSR. It was a Soviet republic, and it remained so all the way up to the dissolution or the fall of the USSR and the Soviet Union in 1991. Up until that time, Ukraine was the number 2 kid on the block, BLOC block. So it was
Eastern Bloc, right?
Yeah, all right, yeah. It was the second most powerful republic, and the other one, the number 1 was Russia, which at that time was also a republic.
What did it mean to be a vassal state in that arrangement? Like, it was all kind of controlled from this hegemonic government in Moscow, and everyone sort of was beholden to that regime. Were they trying to wipe out individual cultural differences and make it more unified? Or what would it have felt like to live in the USSR in Ukraine at that time?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So a vassal state in general terms is going to be a state or a republic or whatever you want to call it that has some degree of independence in its internal affairs. But when it comes to its foreign affairs, that's when another state controls it, basically. So like Ukraine may be able to make laws that apply to its own borders or within its own sphere as a Soviet republic. But then when it came to like who's going to wage war with the Yankees, then that's kind of a Moscow decision.
So Ukraine achieved independence very quickly after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991 in a referendum where over 80% in every region except for Crimea voted for this. In Crimea, it was 55% that voted for independence from the USSR.
Yes, and what did the USSR have, as well as the United States and several other countries? Nukes. Lots and lots of nukes. And Ukraine actually kind of had a lot of the nukes, probably strategically because of how close they were to the rest of Europe and other places that, would have wanted to attack if they had to. Ukraine, just give you a couple of these numbers here. They had 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles, over 1,200 nuclear warheads, 44 strategic bombers, 700 nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, 2,000 tactical nuclear missiles, lots and lots and lots of fissile material.
Yeah, they had the toy box for sure. And it's weird because they only had that for a few short years after their independence. In fact, Russia and the United States teamed up. They worked together to denuclearize Ukraine with a series of diplomatic agreements. So what happened is Kiev gave Russia its nuclear warheads in exchange for a security treaty or a security agreement where Russia said, okay, we'll take the guns, but don't worry, we got your back if anybody comes at you sideways. So
we also won't come at you over you wanting independence. So it was kind of a quid pro quo situation.
A lot of people say a lot of things.
Okay. I mean, it took a while. It took a while for them to come at them over it. I mean, I'm sure they weren't happy about it, but at least they got their nukes back. That's a pretty big flex. You declare independence and have this referendum, and then you're still holding on to Mother Russia's nukes. That's a pretty good bargaining chip.
Right. And at the time, Ukraine did not have the ability to control those nukes. It's a weird situation. Like Russia would be able to launch them, but they were, as you guys point out, due to strategic concerns, they were located in Ukraine. But yes, they did give them back. And unlike several other countries who stepped back from becoming a nuclear state, Ukraine was not immediately demolished by the U.S. Those are just facts. But let's look at Vladimir Putin. You've heard, or Volodymyr, as I think it would be called in Ukraine. You've heard a lot of stuff trying to read into the mind of one person, one very powerful, dangerous person. If we stick to the facts, we know that before he became the longtime leader of post-Soviet Russia, Putin was a KGB officer earlier in his career, and a lot has been made about his experience there. And yes, he was in the trade. He was doing espionage and spy work and intelligence work. But he also carried with him, this is inarguable because he said it himself, he and many in his inner circle, often from that time, have long held several ironclad beliefs. The one you're going to hear most often in the West is the post-Soviet stance of Russia, and it's a very firm stance, it's a red line for them, that no matter what, not once, not never, can Ukraine join something called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Not to be confused with the Japanese fermented soybean, natto, which tastes like diaper smell. I said it.
That's what I've heard.
Nope, don't want that.
How can they enforce that? It's just like part of the agreement for their independence, or obviously is it just more of a decorum thing?
This is a belief that is held by Vladimir Putin and many of his inner circle. Like, this cannot happen. This cannot stand. It will not happen.
We'll do
prevent
whatever
it from
takes
happening
to keep it from happening. I got it.
Yeah. So let's talk about NATO really quickly. Many of us know what it is. It's an organization that was formed back in 1949. Why 1949? Because it was following World War II. It's an intergovernmental military alliance, an alliance of individual governments and countries. They basically got together after the war and said, hey, if you mess with one of these countries, boop, 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 wherever it is in the world, you're messing with all of us. So don't. Cool? That's really what NATO is.
Yeah, we roll deep. It's currently made of 28 European. We roll deep says NATO. Stuff they don't want you to know is not technically a signatory member of NATO. We're a podcast. And I don't know if they take podcasts yet. But so right now there are 28 European countries and then Canada and the US. That is NATO. And there are ally countries or countries who are friendly with NATO and usually move in step with them when their interests align. Because again, countries do not have friends. They have interests. So you'll see Japan doing things in concert with NATO, for instance. The thing is, Russia is, how to say, not super gassed about the idea. They don't love it. They don't love this whole NATO thing. It's not their vibe. And they especially don't love it when former states from the Soviet Union end up joining. NATO, in Russia's perspective, is an expansionist threat. It is not new information by any means. They weren't Shyamalan-ing people when they said, we don't like NATO, don't get into our sphere of influence. But that's still only part of the equation. So anyone, if you remember our earlier episode on 2014 on the annexation of Crimea that March, it's clear that Russia and the West, again, have two very different versions of history and two very different takes on what the future of Ukraine and the entirety of Eastern Europe should be. This conflict, what we're saying is this conflict was a long time in coming, and there is a much bigger game at play. We're talking, we're cry havoc, let slip the dogs of war. Unfortunately, a lot of Americans might believe that the war began in February of 2022. There was a lot of scuttlebutt where people are saying, well, why aren't they calling it an invasion? Why aren't they calling it a war, et cetera, et cetera. But that belief is well-intentioned, but incorrect. Other people might say, nope, the war actually started back in 2014. And this likewise is not entirely accurate, but for the record, if you ask a citizen of Ukraine how long they've been at war with Russia, over 70% are going to say since Crimea, if not before.
Yeah.
That would have been more of a Cold War.
The stuff before, economic tensions, threats, kind of stuff. But Crimea is when the tank treads hit the road, basically. So the retaking or annexation, we'll explain what we mean there, of Crimea was most likely sparked by the ousting of the president at the time, a guy named Viktor Yanukovych. Viktor Yanukovych is very pro-Moscow. And when NATO and the global West were making overtures toward him, Moscow was making these overtures as well, and he went closer to Moscow. And this was, for many people in Ukraine, this was controversial, and they felt, in fact, that he might have been selling out the country to Russia.
There was a trade deal with the European Union that was on the table that he rejected, and he ended up taking a $15 billion bailout essentially from Russia. And that's when stuff started going bad from a citizen's perspective, when you saw protests, and he ended up having to leave.
Right. So this
in terms of making Ukraine more beholden to Russia, and the citizens did not care for that.
Right. Yeah. That was, because keep in mind, at this time, there were still people alive who remembered quite well the days of the USSR. And additionally, and they remember several other tensions, conflicts, less than good things that Orwell would call double plus ungood. Anyway, 1984. But so this is why it's fair to say that Russia's government, including, of course, Vladimir Putin, saw the taking of Crimea less and what's going on in the eastern regions today less as a invasion and more as a return to their equivalent of the good old days, the days of empire. Another thing we point out in our Crimea episode is that Ukraine only officially counted Crimea as part of its land in 1954, when Nikita Khrushchev gifted the land to Ukraine. And he did this partially out of sentimentality, most likely, and then partially as a powerful flex. Look what I can do. And it kind of gave him his stripes in some ways to do some other bigger things later down the line. But to understand what this war is, where it came from, and what the forces involved would like to see in terms of outcome, we have to look at something the West has been pretty shy about exploring in an accurate way, and that is the Russian perspective. So I propose we pause for a word from our sponsors, check the news before we continue, and then dive in.